Well, good morning. It is the second Friday of the month, so uh, that means I get to eat bologna. Well, no, I did eat bologna. I had a fried bologna sandwich. Um, it was very good. Don't know how good for you it is, but it made me happy. Um, Now we go to Joplin. Rick and Linda and Velda and I go to Joplin to the Souls Harbor mission on the second Friday of every month, and some of our crew, our ministry team goes on the third Wednesday of every month. That would Dr. Adrian takes a bunch down there. We kind of split up the duty so we could cover an extra night at uh, at Souls Harbor, and so we're very glad to go there. It's only about an hour and a half, and Joplin is a historic city, and it has a historically historically tough downtown, and that's where we go because that is where the poor and the halt and the lame are. In any city, wherever the rail yard is, the homeless are not far from there. That much has changed since the Depression. Um, we finished up chapter 13 yesterday with God's exasperation with Judah, where he just finally throws up his hands. Verse 26. Therefore I will discover thy skirts upon thy face, that thy shame may appear. I have seen thine adulteries, and thy neighings, and the lewdness of thy whoredom, and thine abominations on the hills and the fields. Woe unto thee, O Jerusalem! Wilt thou not be made clean? And shall it once be? That was the message about the linen girdle. Now here is a message which actually happened a little after that. And if my math is correct, Zedekiah is the king now instead of Jehoiakim. But I can't be absolutely, positively, certainly sure of that. But the context, the other things that are going on in Judah at the time leads me to believe this is at the beginning of Zedekiah's reign, around 600 BC, 601 BC, maybe even 602. The dates are kind of foggy. A, because all these kings are related. B, the last two kings were puppet kings to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And before Jehoiakim was Jehoiachin, and he was a puppet king to, to the Pharaoh of Egypt. Remember, they are pressed like in the wine press, so to speak. Or the olive press. They are caught torn between two lovers, feeling like well, never mind what I felt like. I remember when that song came out in like 75 or something. We were singing it all the time. It's like, because I've got so many lovers, I don't know which is which. It was funny back then if you were stoned, but it's not that funny now. I just realized. Zedekiah, probably the king here. He'll be the last before the captivity of Judah, in the line of David. He certainly didn't behave like David. Only Josiah did there at the end. He was a good king. He loved God. But his sons, not so much. After Josiah, you had a Jehoiachin, and he was an Egyptian, I mean, he was under the rule of the Egyptians. They set him up there as a puppet king. Egypt needed Judah as a buffer between them and Babylon. Babylon wanted to wipe Israel aside so that they could concentrate on defeating Egypt. Judah was caught in the middle. And so the king is also a man in the middle because of the sins and even if he wanted to do good, he couldn't. This is the message of the drought. Chapter 14 of Jeremiah. The word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah concerning the dearth. Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languisheth. They are black unto the ground. They cry, and the cry of Jerusalem is gone up. Their nobles have sent their little ones to the waters. And they came to the pits and found no water. And they returned with their vessels empty. They were ashamed and confounded and covered their heads because the ground is chapped. For there is no rain in the earth. The plowmen were ashamed. They covered their heads. Yea, the hind also calved in the field and forsook it because there was no grass. The wild asses did stand up in the high places, and they snuffed up the wind like dragons, and their eyes did fail, because there was no grass. You know, before Israel went into the land, before they entered Canaan out of the wilderness, Moses, on top of Mount Ebal, he had half of the children of Israel line up on Mount Ebal and half of them line up on Mount Gerizim. He blesses one side, he curses the other. And it was a demonstration of if the people obeyed the commandments of God, if they followed God, then he would bless them. If they didn't, he would curse them. And he's speaking specifically in the land. And it's a phrase used over and over again. And he talks about all the blessings that he will do for them. You're going to be blessed when you get up. You're going to be blessed when you sit down. Blessed when you sleep. Blessed when you rise. Blessed when you go in. Blessed when you come out. Your fields are going to be blessed. Your wine, your cattle, your livestock, your crops, your storehouses. Everything will be blessed. You know, the barrels will be full of oil. The jugs and the pots will be full of wine. Everything will be good. Your larder will be full. Grain will overflow the silos, the barns. If you just obey. It said he would open unto you treasure, and the heavens would give rain. And thou shalt be the head and not the tail, and you'll lead and not follow. And you will lend and not borrow. But only this, obey the commandments of the Lord thy God. And go not aside from any of the words which I commanded you. And mainly, Don't go after other gods to serve them. This is in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy. He goes through these many blessings, and I don't have the time to just read all of them. You can read them in chapters 27 and 28 of Deuteronomy. Moses' valedictory message to Israel, the house of Israel, the children of Israel in the wilderness, before they cross Jordan and enter into the promised land, Canaan, the land of milk and honey. But, on the other hand, there came the cursings, and there were many. They were caused because in verse 15, but it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. This is Deuteronomy 28, verse 15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. And he goes through a number of curses, cursing the ground, cursing the baskets, cursing the harvest, cursing the planting, cursing the fields, cursing the vines, cursing the livestock, promising to bring pestilence to consume them, and consumption and fevers and blastings, bringing all these things upon the house of Israel if they would not obey. Deuteronomy 28. God's going to do all this. Sickness, disease, misery, if they don't obey. And one of the curses is the fulfillment of the curse is directly tied to the covenant of the land. What we call, what I always, the Palestinian covenant is what it's called, but the land was not called Palestine then. It's something that modern people call it. Modern Bible commentators call it the Palestinian covenant. They started calling it that back in the 1800s, before there was an Israel. And when the land was called Palestine, of course, it was named that by the Romans around 125 AD. I've always thought of the Palestinian covenant in simple terms. It is the covenant of the land. It is actually part 2 of the Abrahamic covenant. The covenant with Abraham has 2 parts, the promise of the land and the promise of the seed of promise. Because Judah had broken the covenant of the land, they're suffering this drought now that had already been partially fulfilled. Here's what God says about the drought. He says, and it's a curse, a specific curse for disobeying God and breaking the covenant of the land. Verse 23 of Deuteronomy 28. Thy heaven that is over thy head shall be brass, and the earth that is under thee shall be iron. The Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust. From heaven shall it come down upon thee until thou be destroyed. And then, verse 25, the Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Now, that is what is coming to pass here in full with Judah's breaking of the covenant of the land. It had a partial fulfillment earlier, of course, during the reign of King Ahab. That is the beginning of, not the beginning of Elijah's ministry, but the beginning of what we know about it. This happened roughly 300 years, a little more than 300 years before Jeremiah's preaching in Judah. This takes place in the northern kingdom of Israel, about 200 years before they were brought into captivity by the Assyrians. They had had a series of wicked kings in the north. And old Ahab, he wasn't as bad as some of the kings, but he married a gal who was a witch. She made it a lot worse because she was a daughter and a whore and a prostitute for Baal. And she caused the northern kingdom of Israel to go whoring after Baal. Before Elijah comes on the scene, verse 28, 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 28. So Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son reigned in his stead. Now that's not Captain Ahab that went after Moby Dick. That came a little later. There weren't that many whales in the deserts of Samaria. And in the 38th year of Asa the king of Judah began Ahab the son of Omri to reign over Israel, the northern kingdom. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam. So he's fixing to make it worse. He's going to double down. It wasn't bad enough that he was rotten. he needed help in being even more rotten. Look at this. And it came to pass in verse 31, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Baal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal that he had built in Samaria. His old lady got him to build a temple to Baal, to her god. Then he goes worshiping too. He's a whoring after other gods. And Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. What the scripture said, he was bad enough until he got married, and then he got worse. I've known a lot of people that's happened to, you know. In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho, and he laid the foundation thereof, and Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof, and his youngest son Zegub, according to the word of the Lord which he spake by Josiah, the son of Nun. About 500 years before. One of the great proofs of prophecy is that God brings it to pass, and then we can be assured that the things that he prophesied and brought to pass, if he fulfilled all those prophecies, he will fulfill all the rest of them that haven't been fulfilled yet. Beginning in verse 17, we see Elijah. He comes into focus. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, as the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew or rain these years, but according to my word. And the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, get thee hence, and turn thee eastward, and hide thyself by the brook Cherith that is before Jordan. Anyway, God fed him by a brook. Ravens brought him bread. Then the brook began to dry out, and so Ravens quit bringing bread, so God sent him to live with a widow in Zarephath, and he went. And God protected him for the rest of the drought. Elijah performs miracles there. He makes the widow's cruse of oil and barrel of grain, made it all stay full until it was over, until the drought was over. He raised her son from the dead. Chapter 18, in this drought. And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go show thyself unto Ahab, and I'll send rain upon the earth. And Elijah went to show himself to Ahab, and there was a sore famine in Samaria. So this is a partial fulfillment of the curse of the land because of the breaking of the covenant of the land. At this time, the northern kingdom of Israel had a chunk of the land, and the southern kingdom of Judah had a chunk of the land. It was all one land in God's eyes. So he made it. That's how he gave it to Abraham. So there was a partial fulfillment in the northern part 300 years before there was the final fulfillment to the southern part, because their sins were different. Judah was allowed to continue about 100 years or a little more past Israel, when Israel fell to the Assyrians, and then the great Assyrian world empire before Babylon, because there were some godly kings in Judah that trusted God and worshiped God and caused the people to worship God. And Ahab called Obadiah, which was the governor of his house. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, for it was so, when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, that Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50 in a cave, and fed them with bread and water. Anyway, Ahab tells Obadiah to go look for water, and he's going to go look for water anywhere they can water the flocks. And he said that the land is perished. Maybe we can save a few of the beasts, a few cows. Maybe we can save something. Let's go look for water. Well, you know the story. Ahab and all of his false prophets and army, they show up at Mount Carmel to meet Elijah, and they have the duel between the prophets. Elijah repairs the altar of the Lord that had fallen down. It rains, and there's a flood, and the drought ends. For 3.5 years, God showed the northern kingdom of Israel what he could do because of their disobedience. He did far worse than this to them. He took them into captivity later. But he showed them. And it was a partial fulfillment of what's going on now in Judah, 300 years later. The sign was followed by captivity. The cursing of the land, because the people of the land had broken the covenant of the land. He carried that out on Israel and on their part of the land, the northern half, and took them into captivity and sent them captive, all their rich people and kings and royal people. They sent them all to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Back then, Babylon was just a province, a small kingdom of a province of the Assyrian Empire, and they fought with the kings of Assyria in their army until they got strong enough to take over. When they took over, they started invading Judah, the southern part of the land. the down payment is never as bad as the real thing. You know, your down payment on a car is a lot less than what you pay for the car. It's like marriage licenses. You know, I married some kids the other day. It cost, I don't know, 50, $60 to get a marriage license in Missouri now. Well, it's really changed. When Velda and I got married, I paid, well, it was kind of an installment plan. My marriage license cost me $7.50 plus all I could make for the rest of my life. $7.50 down. Well, that's another story. Anyway, when the Northern Kingdom was taken into captivity, it should have been a warning to the Southern Kingdom, but they didn't take it as a warning because they hated Israel, and they said, well, they just got what they deserved, because they were constantly, not constantly, but they were often at war with each other. There were some times when kings of Judah and Israel collaborated and went to war together, and sometimes even good kings of Judah got sucked into that trap, like good old King Jehoshaphat, that wound up going to war with Ahab for no good reason at all against Syria. But you see, the same thing that happened to Israel was now happening to Judah, but they never took it to heart. Their sister, their brother tribes, their sister nation, Israel, whose capital was Samaria, north of the river, to the north of Jerusalem. Yeah, that extra special haircut, Gayla. Yeah. This is the deal, man. Velda cut it, and I didn't like the way it was hanging down on my ears, and it felt weird. It didn't look bad, but it felt different. And I just said, hey, baby, just cut it all off like you usually do. Just shear it back, and we'll let it grow again, and it'll all be the same length. That way we don't have to worry about trimming here and there. And she said that was good for her. So it was, and it was done. It's just like shearing sheep. Anyhow, Judah should have took this as a warning, but they didn't. And so now it's worse in Judah than it was in Israel. The drought is worse, or what they call the dearth. The ground is drier. Remember in the last chapter it said that, therefore I will scatter them as the stubble that passeth away in the winds of the wilderness. It's when everything dries up and just blows away. See? It just dries up and blows away. Our faith can dry up and blow away too. That's why we keep doing this. Let's look at this again. The word of the Lord, chapter 14, verse 1. This is a message on the drought. The word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah concerning the dearth. Judah mourneth, and the gates thereof languish, just like Israel did. And they are black under the ground, and the cry of Jerusalem is gone up, just like the cry of Israel went up. Remember, their king was out on a mule, and his chief advisor, Obadiah, was out on a mule, one of the few mules that had not died, and they're walking around with a few men with them trying to find a little bit of water to keep what cattle they got alive, even though they got nothing to feed them. Oh, it is a bad, bad, hard time. A bad, hard time. I wonder how much help Jezebel's family there in Tyre and Zidon, where modern Lebanon is, I wonder how much help that her family gave Israel during this time. Something had to keep them alive because the land wasn't feeding them and God wasn't feeding them, so they had to get some grain from somewhere. But I guarantee you, if they got any supplies, only the rich people got them. Poor people, they were eating bread and water because Obadiah, remember, he was hiding a few preachers in a cave. so that Jezebel couldn't get to him and kill him. Man, people starving to death, but they're still sacrificing to devils. I wonder if they were looking for water for the livestock so that Jezebel could sacrifice those animals to Baal. I don't know. We don't have any more detail on that. But we do know that they were crazy upon their gods. When the priests of Baal when the prophets of Baal and the prophets of the grove, when they were making their sacrifices, they went mad upon the sacrifices to their gods. Maybe they were all mad. Their nobles have sent their little ones to the waters. You know, if you live in the big house, you don't go fetch water. You send somebody after it. So they still had some rich people in Judah. They live in the big house. We live down the hill. In the shacks. The sharecropper shacks. Not up to the big house. The only time you go to the big house, you might go to the back door. You're doing some chore for the Lord of the manor. You're doing some chore for the master, and they might give you a glass of iced tea or something, but you stand outside and drink it. I remember I was about 4 or 5 years old. Daddy took me to work with him. He was putting some outside lights, carriage lights they called them, on a carriage house. And that's what rich people used to call their garages. Because in the old days, of course, they stored carriages in there, but they still call them carriages house. And it was a long old deal. And it's in River Oaks where the rich people live. You know, that's where George Bush the Elder lived, down there in Houston. And I don't remember the guy's name. He was a banker, but he was an old carpetbagger. His daddy come down with a carpet bag and helped rape the South, you know, during Reconstruction. And it was part of the Yankee occupation, you might say. That's not how history looks at it, but that's how Texans look at it. But he was an old carpetbagger, and he was an old man. He had to have been 80, 90 years old when I was 5, because I just remember he was just barely getting around, and his hair was all white and stuck up every which way, and he had white whiskers. He hadn't shaved in a while, but rich people staying at home, they can do whatever they want to do. Daddy shaved every morning because that's what you're supposed to do when you go out and work on people's property. Anyway, we were out there working, and I was probably making too much racket. The guy come out and told my daddy to keep that kid quiet, talking about me. And Daddy tried to keep me quiet, and I got a little cantankerous a little bit later, and the old man come out again and says, "I told you, boy, to keep that kid quiet." Daddy turned around and looked at him, and he says, "I tell you what, Mr. So-and-so," I don't remember his name. I just know he was rich, and he lived in a rich people's house, and he had a butler, and he had a carriage house. And I know that we was just hired people to come. And Daddy turned around and looked at that old man, and he said, "I tell you what," and says, "Do you want your lights fixed?" The old man said, "Of course." And Daddy said, "Then you go back in the house, and I'll fix your lights. But if you come out here and talk to me like that again, I'm just going to leave, and you won't have no lights." And that old man called my daddy an unreconstructed cur. Now, I didn't know what unreconstructed means, because I didn't know what reconstructed meant. I didn't know what a cur was, but I remembered it. And when I was 7 or 8, I looked up the words. So I asked Daddy about it, and he wouldn't talk about it. He just said that the old man was a blank, blank Yankee. That's what Daddy said. But I was a reconstructed cur. Rich people don't go to fetch their own water, they send for it. So you see, there were still rich people here in Judah. There were still rich people here in Judah who were sending people to look for water. Now, it tells you how bad it was in Israel, because who was out looking for the water? The king and one of his ministers on starving mules. They were the ones out looking for water. So things that had to got pretty bad for the king himself to go out and look for water. So he might have got so tired of being in the house with Jezebel that he had to get out and go do something. and the golf course was all eat up. There wasn't no grass left because of the drought, so he couldn't play golf. He'd be in a sand trap the whole time. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. You have to forgive me. I've talked for a long time. Their nobles sent their little ones to the waters. They came to the pits and found no water. They returned with their vessels empty. They were ashamed and covered their heads. Why were the little ones, the servants, why were they ashamed? Because they didn't fulfill their master's tasks. You see, among humans, we're always a little bit ashamed when we don't do what the boss expects of us. How come we don't feel like that as Christians? When we don't do what our master commands us to do, we don't cry about it. We're not that ashamed. We say, well, I'm forgiven. I'm saved by grace. Well, that's all true. You still got to do your job. We have a job to do. We have work to do. We need to do our job. Our job is to take the gospel of Christ to a lost and dying world. That is our job. That is our task. And we lay up on it. We lay off on it all the time. Oh, the ground was chapped. There was no rain in the earth. The plowmen were ashamed. See, the farmers couldn't bring in the crops, so they're ashamed. Why were they ashamed? Well, they disappointed the king. They disappointed the rich people. But in America, translate that to this: they didn't do their job. The biggest insult to an upright, upstanding American citizen is for some guy in a tie to walk up to him while he's sweating and working his butt off and say, "You're not doing your job." That's why I get really out of patience with these politicians. You know what politicians do half the time? You got people who don't work telling people who do work how to work. And we got these geniuses reigning over us that, in the first place, they wouldn't know how to change the oil in their own car. In the second place, I wouldn't take their word that night's dark and day's light. The wild asses did stand up in the high places, and they snuffed up like the wind like dragons, and their eyes did fail because there was no grass. Even the beast knew that there was something wrong. I see all these dogs on TV, that are locked out in the snow. If your idea of having a dog is keeping them outside on a rope or a chain, you don't need to have a dog. You need to be horsewhipped. You sure don't need a dog. But I see those commercials where they want to get you to send money in. And I would say, don't send money in. And, if you want to give money, give it to your local shelter, because that's where they'll spend it on the animals. But even the beasts know that something's wrong. I see my dog and other people's dogs. We go out for walks and stuff. And even the dogs know there's something wrong. Have you noticed how many crows there are? In my neighborhood here in town, the crows have taken over, or at least they did long into the fall. The crows have taken over from all the other birds that usually reign in this neighborhood. There were far less bluebirds and cardinals, wood hens, pigeons even. And it's like the street is ruled by black crows. And it's not just on my street. It's on several other streets that we walk down. I saw crows and squirrels fighting over acorns the other day in the yard. Just like the wild ass, even the animals know that something's wrong, that something's coming. This was concerning the dearth, the drought. I have to quit for today, but I would remind you that there are more ways that God can curse the land than with a drought. Come to Him today. If you're not a Christian, come to Him today. Believe that Jesus suffered and died for your sins according to the Scriptures, and that He was buried, and that He rose the third day according to the Scriptures. And if you are already saved, if you already belong to Jesus, do your job. Do your job.